Lecture 8. This is part 2 of 4 parts, and we're working towards quiz 8. Yeah, last time we saw that the art capital of the world shifted from Paris all the way over to here, New York City. Hey, when we were looking at Cubism, I showed you this painting, American artist Mark Tansey, called Picasso and Braque. And Tansey likes to address art historical, art critical issues, and here we see Picasso and Braque with Cubism getting modernism off the ground. Well, Tansey also did this painting, Triumph of the New York School, and it's very interesting and also instructive. So here we see a battlefield in the distance, and shells are still falling, but in the foreground we have a peace treaty being signed. So it's at the very end of a conflict. And on the left side, we see the losing army. And it's a French army because of the uniforms. And also the uniforms are from World War I. And if you start looking at the combatants there, like that guy, well, that's Cézanne. Or this guy here, that's Picasso. So this is the French school that was triumphant prior to World War II. During World War I, yeah, the French painters, the French school, dominated the art world. But if you go to the other side, it's an entirely different time frame. It's World War II. You see the half track back there. This is American uniforms. And right there, we have American artists slash soldiers. That's Jackson Pollock. And in the foreground, right there, that's Clement Greenberg himself, presiding over this ceremony, this surrender of the French school. So if you step back and read the painting, what this is saying is that the art capital of the world shifts from Paris, France, to New York City after World War II. And it's all presided over or orchestrated by the art critic. And again, that is the power now of American art criticism. So we're in New York, New York, right? And it is the new art capital of the world after World War II. And the very first modernist movement that New York City is responsible for is called abstract expressionism. And look at the dates up there. It starts at the end of World War II, 1945, and it runs strong until about 1960. So it completely dominates the art scene during the 1950s. If I ask you that on a quiz or a test, abstract expressionism ruled the 1950s. And right there are the culprits. These are the abstract expressionists. And that guy right there smoking a cigarette is Jackson Pollock. I point him out because he was especially important. Look at this Life magazine, 1949. And what does that say way down there? It says this. Is he, Jackson Pollock, the greatest living painter in the United States? Man, what a question, if not, what a claim. Because America suddenly is like confronted with this, and America now is being told Pollock is the greatest painter in the United States. Because prior to that, we thought like Grant Wood, Edward Hopper, or maybe even Norman Rockwell, were a representative of America's best. But now, the art critic in New York City is telling us, no, you've been wrong all this time. It is Jackson Pollock. That's quite the transition for the public to reckon with. Look, abstract expressionism, dominating the 1950s, had two branches. We'll look at one first and then the other. The first one we're looking at is called gestural branch of abstract expressionism. The buzzword during the 50s was gesture. And by gesture, it was meant the energetic, expressive brushstroke. But gestural branch abstract expressionism is also referred to as action painting, and I'll explain that term later. So the first branch we're looking at really falls under two different labels, gestural and action painting. And let's look at Pollock. We'll be looking at two gestural painters, and Pollock is the first one. And if we look back through what we've learned so far in the semester, some of the influences behind Pollock's painting, should make some kind of sense to us. During World War II, when things started to close in on artists, a lot of them decided to jump ship and go over to America to escape the conflict. And one of those artists was Mondrian. Maybe it had something to do with his mustache. He wanted to get out of the country. And, he did this painting here, Broadway Boogie Woogie, right? He did that in New York City. And there we see a photograph of Mondrian in his New York apartment. And he actually died in New York City. And with this influx of not only of European artists, but like cutting edge modernist artists, the avant-garde coming to America, the local artists in New York City, these Americans, started to hang out with them because they were famous. And the New York artists wanted to, learn things from them. So they would go out, have beers, talk all night long, and share ideas. And during this process, during World War II, the New York American artist, received such an education on what avant-gardism was there in Europe. Remember, prior to World War II, there was very little exposure to European modernism in American art. So, what are some of the things that the New York artists learned from their European counterparts? Well, the expressive brushwork was one of them, like German Expressionism's The Bridge. And that's where, ultimately, the gesture comes from. Another influence was non-objective painting, for sure, and that too came from German Expressionism, the Blue Rider branch with Kandinsky. Another form of non-objective painting, as we know, is geometric abstraction, like Mondrian's De Style. And another influence is that accident chance component to art that Dada introduced into the process. But the most important influence was from biomorphic surrealism. Jungian psychoanalysis really spoke to the Americans, maybe because it sounded so heady. And remember, under Jungian psychoanalysis, we had the collective memory theory, and we also had the stream of consciousness, very important to the biomorphic surrealists. And the stream of consciousness was tapped into in art through automatism. Remember? We have automatism causing accidents, and I can show you Messon's glue painting. He puts glue on a canvas, then shakes sand over it, and that's his automatism. Accidents occur, and from there that taps into his collective memory, and the stream of consciousness kicks in, and he starts to create from those those artistic bones there on his canvas. We also, from biomorphic surrealism, had the theme artist as shaman, and we saw that with Max Ernst. So going back to the Americans with Jackson Pollock, we see that Pollock, yeah, he tapped into all of those influences and he adopted his own form of automatism, and that was drips. He would drip paint on his canvases, and that is equivalent to his form of gesture. So drips really were the backbone of Pollock's vocabulary. And his paintings were called, indeed, drip paintings. So here is a classic Pollock or a classic drip painting by Pollock. In fact, the press started to refer to Pollock as Jack the Dripper, playing off Jack the Ripper. So drip paintings we associate with Pollock. Yeah, typically, an artist, and this is commonsensical, would have a panel or canvas on an easel to work. Not so with Pollock. He put his canvases down on the floor like rugs, and he would walk around the canvas and he would fling paint or drip paint from paint cans with paint brushes or even just sticks. He would sometimes enter the canvas flicking the paint around. And this is his form of automatism, creating accidents until something started to take shape. That's his stream of consciousness, and he reacted to it, and he would develop those ideas. And he would continue until finally it's almost done. Let's see what's missing. I need one more drip. He puts it there, and he has a masterpiece lying there on the floor. Now, because he's painting on this rug-like canvas, Pollock's paintings are huge. Indeed, abstract expressionists in general worked on a pretentiously large scale, on pretentiously large canvases. Yes, one thing to remember. Hey, yeah, so with abstract expressionism, which had a phenomenal influence on subsequent developments of American modernism, one of the main influences is that the canvases become really big. And when you go to a museum and look at a Pollock, it generally occupies one entire wall, like one wall per painting. In contrast to European modernism, we're looking at Mondrian's here, you can put a number of those paintings on a single wall. So American artists, maybe expressing the expansiveness of the American territory, continent, painted on a very large scale. Hey, let's look at the other term, action painting. Importantly, this term was devised by another New York City art critic. His name is Harold Rosenberg, and he was really the dominant voice to American modernism during the 1950s, so remember that. And Rosenberg looked at these abstract expressionists and saw how critical the theatrical performance aspect of the creative process was, how Pollock and other artists would do like a ritualistic dance before their canvas. And he said, well, we need to include that in our conception of what new art is all about. So he said action takes in this performance aspect, and painting refers to the final product. And together, they nicely balance the two components of the creative process, action, and then the final product of that action, painting. So action painting is the term introduced by Harold Rosenberg. Another thing he brought in is this biomorphic surrealism influence of shamanism. And here we're looking at Max Ernst again, how it was believed that the very earliest artists, we're talking about cave art now, was created by shamans. So there's this magical connection or even spiritual connection between artist and artwork. And Max Ernst, biomorphic surrealism, donned this costume and also assumed the role of shaman when he created his works of art. So artist assumes the role of shaman is another influence that Harold Rosenberg plugged into when he interpreted abstract expressionism. And he said Pollock used his canvas as an arena, and Pollock would enter the arena and do his ritualistic dance, his drip painting, and by so doing assume the role of a shaman. And he tapped into his subconscious mind to communicate through these drip paintings, automatism, and accidents, this thought process, this stream of consciousness. Again, this is just an argument by Rosenberg, but the art world, bought it. And the creative action painting, was codified by Rosenberg. And you have all of these drip paintings. Now, importantly, by Pollock here, importantly, according to art criticism, there is spiritual and emotional content captured in these drip paintings by Pollock and all of the works by the other abstract expressionists. So that too follows that European pre-World War II interpretation of art that we saw going back to the very beginning of non-objective painting, with Kandinsky going through suprematism and de style with those geometric abstractions. So all of this painting, including abstract expressionism, according to art criticism, has spiritual and emotional content. All right, that's the end of part 2.